Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can see us. I would like to welcome everyone very cordially at our next seminar of multiculturalism and migration observatory in Krakow. We have a great pleasure today to host a fantastic speaker with us, came to us from Mexico. So before I introduce Alethia, I would love to say that we also started a new format. We come back after the long pandemic time of just online seminars. With this one, we start again our hybrid seminars. So we want to have a discussion both in our place at the university as well as the online discussion. So let's hope the pandemic is over and we can continue with face-to-face discussions for the future. I would like to introduce our fantastic guest, and I'm really very grateful that Alethia managed to come to us from Mexico. Alethia Fernández de la Reguera Ahedo, she's a full-time researcher at the Institute of Legal Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She's also a coordinator of the National Diversities Laboratory of the university, and she collaborates in some research tracks connected to migration, such as rights, migrations, mobilities, and empirical studies of law. In 2021, Alethia received National University Distinction Award for Young Scholars in the area of social science research. She's also a researcher at Seminar, which is a comparative analysis on international migration and displacement in the Americas. And Alethia is a great expert on migration, gender issues, forced migration, immigration detention, gender violence, and women's autonomy. So we hope to connect this topic and to hear more on that topics, as well as it will be our first webinar, which is focused on Mexico and in Latin America in general, and I hope not the last one, as also our university at the Casper Center. There will be now new projects connected to migration research in Latin America. So with this seminar, we also are very eager to learn more about the patterns of migration, about the challenges that that Latin American countries face at the moment. Yeah, and to begin, a research journey that let's hopefully will lead us to great knowledge and great discussions. Before I give the floor to Alethia, I just wanted to mention a couple of words on the format of the seminar. So Alethia would be speaking first and presenting her research on forced migration, asylum, and human rights in Mexico. And after that presentation, we will have, as usually, time for a Q&A. So please write down any questions, comments that you have. And there will be option, either for the people here in the room to ask questions directly, and for our guests who connect via Zoom, you will be able to use either Zoom or you could also ask your question directly afterwards. You just signal this to us, and we will give voice to it. So again, welcome in Krakow, Alethia, and we are very, very happy to have you here and to hear about your research. So I give the floor.
Thank you so much. Before starting, I would really like to thank my colleagues from the University of Krakow for inviting me today. Thank you very much, Professor Dobrawska, for organizing the seminar, and my colleagues who are here face-to-face sharing this seminar with us, and for the ones who are following through Zoom. I don't know if I can start sharing my screen. Yeah, we have been sharing. Okay, perfect. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So it was a big challenge to decide what to present today, especially when I know that very respectful colleagues of mine are here with us. So part of my presentation would be first to describe a little bit about the context and the similarities that I found between the context of mobilities, the patterns of mobilities in Latin America, particularly in Mexico, in parallel to what we are seeing or what I'm learning from these few days that I've been spending in Poland and following the mobilities patterns and migration policies in the European Union. So the idea would be to have a dialogue, of course, among both perspectives. And the second part of my presentation, I will present particularly what I've been doing, like part of my research. I am a sociologist and I do work with a qualitative approach. I have been working on ethnography, institutional ethnography for the last 4 years. I have conducted an ethnography in an immigration detention center in the border between Mexico and Guatemala. So more or less, that's the idea of my presentation today. I will start by first having a broad perspective on it's difficult, no? If you ask me, we need to discuss issues on mobility and migration policies in Latin America. There are many things happening in the region, but I would start by saying that the most important thing is migration dynamics of most Latin American countries have undergone substantial transformation over the past 20 years. We cannot think, we need to understand the complexity of Latin America. It's not that it's only, or it was only a region of expulsion, of origin of economic migration. Historically, there has been also a lot of internal migration in the region, like many migration, economic migration going to the countries like Argentina, like Chile, Uruguay. These are migrations coming from Bolivia, from Peru. But recently, I would say in the last 20 years, the transformation of the region is that it has become a region of transit and also very important, a region of destination of forced migration. So the paradigm, and it's important to mention, even maybe for us that we study migration is something obvious, but in terms of policy making and in terms of law, it's not that obvious that still policies are understood as policies for economic migration and not for forced migration. So we keep seeing this contradiction or this tension between international protection mechanisms for forced migrants and in the other side, immigration policies that are understood and designed to address economic migration. So traditionally, as I said, an immigration region now is becoming a destination area of forced migration, and there are different examples around the region. I need to mention, even though I do not work with Venezuelans immigrants, it's very important to understand that the Venezuelan diaspora has completely changed the pattern in the whole region. We have 6 million Venezuelans, migrants, and also refugees and asylum seekers that are within the region. So imagine that Venezuela used to be also a country that used to receive migrants from Colombia. And since the last 5 years, maybe 10 years, but in the last 5 years, it has clearly, we started to have this crisis of diaspora of Venezuelans asking for refugee. And this made important changes in the region because legislations, I must say, around all the region have changed. The most recent legislation is from Chile, but I must say that around the region, new legislation in the last 10 years have approached immigration policies, not just immigration policies, okay? And this is something that started with Venezuelans, but Venezuelans are not the only nationalities or the asylum seekers in the region. I will explain a little bit later about Haiti also. The Haiti diaspora is very important. Haiti is the poorest country in the region, and people from Haiti have fled from their country of origin maybe 8-10 years ago, and they have been around different countries. And last year, recently, there were big group of Haitians arriving to Mexico, but they are coming from Brazil, they are coming from Chile, they are coming from Argentina. So the perspective is what's happening in this country. because these are not economic migrants. Again, I mean, especially people from Haiti, they have fled natural disasters, they have fled the earthquake, they have fled poverty, and still there are no opportunities for having access to international protection in Brazil or in Chile or in Argentina, and they end up in Mexico trying to get to the US. I'm sorry if I'm going very quick, but also it's important for me to, even though it can be obvious, but Mexico has a very particular geographical position because Mexico has one of the biggest borders in the world with the UN, with the United States. So this makes Mexico a very particular country for understanding immigration flows and the diversity of immigrants. Many people don't know, or they think that Mexico only receives people from Central American countries, but Mexico receives people from China, from Pakistan, from India, from last year we had 17 different countries, African countries, that of nationalities that were arriving to Mexico seeking asylum to the US. So analyzing Mexican immigration policy is very much connected to understanding US migration policies and US control and securitization of borders. So I was explaining that more or less these changes have started to happen in the region in the last 20 years. And we must say, I mean, there are good things happening around. Changes have been made to legal migration frameworks to include human rights perspective, and the Cartagena protection framework. But I was talking to my colleague Conrad the other day. I will explain it a bit more, that it would be a good practice that in the region we don't only work asylum procedures through Geneva Convention, but also there is this regional convention, Cartagena, that enlarges the protection mechanisms. And regularization procedures and access to rights are shared paradigms in the legal frameworks of countries such as Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Uruguay. But as you will see in the second part of my presentation, one thing would be what we have in our legal frameworks, and another different situation is the interpretation of these norms, the interpretations of frameworks. That's why I am very much interested in doing qualitative ethnographic work to understand what happens between having this legal framework that actually is not bad. Actually, if you see the Mexican Constitution and you see the Mexican migration law, actually enlarges some rights such as health services and education to immigrants, irregular immigrants as well. But in practice, once that the immigrants need to have real access to medical service or to education, then you find institutional violence and different types of obstacles. So for the moment, I don't know if everything is fine, if you're following me. So now I will start to talk particularly about Mexico. Mexico, in the last year, 2021, broke an all-time record of immigration detentions with a total of 307,679 migrants detained. So in Mexico today, and I think this is also something that, of course, if we go through the US immigration policy and in the European Union, detention is becoming a central issue to discuss migration policy. The criminalization and securitization of borders in Mexico has taken a very important pace in the last, I must say, 10 years and 10 years ago. In the year 2014 was a very important year because there was a pact signed between Mexico and the US to enforce technology and to enforce securitization and militarization of borders. And today, Mexico is one of the countries in the whole region with the highest numbers of detained immigrants. So it's important to discuss detention, not only from the part of criminalization, but also because I was talking about this tension or this conflict between international protection mechanisms and criminalization. And what we have now is that asylum seekers are detained, or that people, while in detention, start their procedures. And this has important impacts in terms of actually having access to the proper procedure for asylum request. And sometimes, I mean, the way, that's what I study, the way detention centers function is that they limit in a big way access to human rights and the access to justice and the access to a procedure. So many asylum seekers are being detained and deported. So we also need to discuss detention in terms of international law and international protection mechanisms. We talked today about a vertical border. What you are seeing here is a map of Mexico, and important to say that orange spots are houses for migrants, shelters, NGOs. Mexico has a very big tradition in contrast with other countries in the region. Why? Because Mexico, along the whole 20th century, was a country of transit and a country of origin of migrants. So all the orange spots used to be places or shelters for Mexicans going to the US. Then in the last 10 years ago, they started receiving Mexican deported from the US. Let's remember that it was not Donald Trump, the administration with a higher number of deportations. It was Obama's, and before Obama with Bush, and before Bush, Clinton administration was a moment where militarization and criminalization of the border started to enforce. Actually, the first wall was built by Bill Clinton in 1996. It was Donald Trump who made it very public, but I mean the idea of the walls. So all these orange spots that you are seeing are very important now to understand who is actually organizing protection mechanisms for migrants, because it's not the government, it's not the local government or the federal government, but it's the local NGOs that are around the country. But we call it vertical border because it's important for me to show, it's the blue triangles. You are seeing blue and green squares. These are all immigration detention centers along the country. And we call it vertical border because what used to be a border control, what we have now is immigration detentions around the whole country. Something very important to discuss, and all these points maybe I would like to connect with the situation in Poland. I think that's why I'm here also to share what's the impact and the consequence of having the military as the federal force in charge of immigration control. In the year 2019, Donald Trump sent a tweet saying that if Mexico couldn't stop migration in the south, the US would have increased a 5% tariff in Mexican imports. And you can imagine that Mexican economy depends much on the imports to the US. So in that moment, the reaction of the Mexican government was 2 days after that, they were already in the US, in Washington, negotiating, and the negotiation was to have at least, now we have 7,000, but at that moment were 3,000 soldiers controlling the border. So it has clear impacts in terms of human rights and in terms of international protection, that the first contact between a migrant and the state is with the military forces. So this vertical border, actually the map has changed a bit because now we have more detention centers. The strategy has been to increase the number of detention centers instead of complying with international law and complying with the Mexican law that the Mexican state is obliged to have alternative detention programs, and for the last 3 years, these programs have been lost. So I try to go quickly here. It's just important to understand that there is this phenomenon, the migrant caravans is not a new phenomenon, but it's a phenomenon that is telling us something. The caravans, the massive caravans started at the end of year 2018. These were caravans coming from Honduras, from Guatemala, and from El Salvador. And these people, the ones who are migrating in caravans, are the most vulnerable people. Either are the people that were not able to pay for a smuggler, that maybe have been trying to leave their countries, but most of them are families, mothers with young children, people with discapacities, elder people. For the first time, you were seeing 70-year-old, 75-year-old people at the borders, and they migrate massively to arrive to the points of entry, the formal points of entry, asking for asylum. This is not economic migration, and unfortunately, the approaches of the Mexican government and the US in this region has been still to address this as economic migration. Vice President of the US, Kamala Harris, recently visited Central American countries, and the proposal is, let's have more investment of enterprises such as Nestle, Procter & Gamble. Let's have more jobs for Central Americans. But these people that are migrating in the caravans, what they need is international protection. They are fleeing from criminal violence in their country of origins. Gangs is a big problem. Gangs that actually were created originally in LA. These were second generation migrants from El Salvador, from Honduras in the 80s, and with the guerrillas. Actually, these migrants were deported, and they arrived very, very young back to their countries without any opportunities and with all the experience of gangs in LA, and they created these gangs just as Maras, etc. Central Americans are migrating not only because of criminal violence, but also natural disasters. And I think there is a big challenge for us as migrant scholars to start really creating these bridges between the studies of climate change risks in the region and what's really as one of the primary sources of migration. So, and that's a problem again, that in terms of international protection, the Geneva Convention does not recognize climate change or natural disasters as a cause for immigration, as a cause for asylum seeking. The Cartagena Declaration of Refugees is the instrument that we have alternative to Geneva. Actually, in Mexico, we use both. Without caravans, the Mexican government started to use more Cartagena than Geneva Convention because it's more broader. It was adopted in 1984, and it extends that refugee definition. And I think it's something that you are also discussing here. Does the Geneva Convention still is it enough to understand that the particular situations that we're seeing now? And the Cartagena, the definition is first of a refugees, persons who have fled their country because their lives, security, or freedom have been threatened by generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violation of human rights, or other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. So this means that with Cartagena, you don't have to go case by case. You can recognize that a whole group, like the Hondurans, are victims of this type of violence or this internal conflict, and it's easier to proceed with the applications. So it has a broader temporal and geographical scope. It covers some of the indirect effects such as poverty, economic decline, inflation, violence, disease, food insecurity, malnourishment, and displacement. What you are going to see now, and I'm sorry because it's not, you can see the numbers. These are the applications for refugee status received in Mexico. Can you see how much it has increased in the last 5 years? In the year 2016, we were receiving almost 9,000. And last year, this figure is not, it was taken at the end of 2021. We ended last year with 120,000 applications. So the change has been very fast, and the problems is not, Mexico actually was one of the only countries during the pandemic that still received applications. So this was a good practice. We never closed. The borders didn't close, and we never stopped receiving applications. But see the next graph. Here is the problem. The blue line are the applications received, and the orange one are the applications that have been recognized, and So the orange one are the ones that have been positively recognized, and the green ones are the ones that has been negatively recognized. So there is this enormous gap between the number of applications received and the different obstacles and the non-capacity of the government to actually proceed with these applications. So these people at the end up in a limbo. Also, because the only way to get regular status, one of the only ways to get regular status now in Mexico is through asylum. And in the Mexican immigration law, there are different mechanisms to get regulation. But in practice, even though we had a good law, if you analyze Mexican law, it has a human rights approach, different mechanisms for regularization, but everything is given to the asylum law. So the only way to get regular in Mexico is through asylum, and maybe not all migrants need asylum. So that's also another problem that we're seeing. And at the end, there is one important thing to say, that when you ask for asylum in a state in Mexico, you need to wait in that state until your procedure is resolved. And 80% of the asylum applications start in Chiapas. Chiapas is the poorest state in Mexico. It's a border with Guatemala. It's a state with very high numbers of unemployment, of poverty, of violence. So you cannot have 85% of your procedures in the Chiapas state because people are not going to survive and are not going to be able to produce and to have an independent life. So I think I already explained that we are one of the largest immigration systems in the world, and in Latin America, of course. In 2020, there was a reform to prohibit children's detention, and this was a good practice. But in reality, as always, if there is not political will, what we have now is children are not being detained. Children are being taken together with their mothers. That's also it's a gender issue that we can discuss there. But they are taken with their mothers to shelters or to special places, but they are in very, very precarious conditions. I couldn't say this, but I'm going to say it. Is true. I mean, you can think, what could be better? I mean, the conditions of these shelters are something that very dehumanizing. So I would say, like, in terms of basic necessities, they are best covered in a detention center than outside of detention. But we cannot say this because, of course, what we're saying is we need to end with detentions. But just to say that you can have a reform, but without political will and without budget, children are taken to even unsafer places and worse places than the detention centers. So at the end, what we're talking about is a global governance of migration and asylum. That the global governance of migration and asylum promotes a strategy to control human mobility, particularly by criminalizing and detaining migrants. And here is where I'll start with my own part of the project that I've been working in the past 4 years. Here in this map, you can see the detention centers in Mexico. You remember the vertical border with, well, these are all the different immigration points along the country. So you can have people, most of them are in the south part because we received from the southern border, but also we have many cases of deported. Now with the pandemic and before the pandemic in the year 2019, for the first time, the US started the externalization of its borders through a program that is called Mexican Migration Protocols. And with that program, people seeking asylum in the US should wait in the Mexican side until their hearings and the procedure is over in the US. So, kind of doubling, yes. And the other problem is that with the pandemic, the US also started another mechanism for express deportation that is Title 42, that is under the under threats for public health. They launched this mechanism. So what we've seen now, harder than ever, is that we have express deportations of Central Americans deported to Mexico. That was something that never happened before. But with the background of having migration, the MPP migration protection protocols in the last 3 years that Central Americans are waiting in the Mexican side, for the US government has been very easy during the pandemic to deport Central Americans. So what we have now is Central Americans deported to Mexico, taken into immigration detention centers in the northern border, and then deported again to their countries of origin. So this is a way that the US is cheaper for them because they don't have to deport people by flight to their country. So they just put them in the border and the Mexican government has to take part of it. And the way the Mexican government solves it is through more detention centers. And then there is this circuit that from the north, they end up in the southern border centers and then they get deported. So my research questions, I have different, but well, the most important one is first, why has detention increased and what are the impacts on international protection? How do detention centers operate? And how do the subjectivities of federal immigration agents affect the implementation of migration and asylum policy in detention centers? And here's my ethnographic passion and my ethnographic part, that is, I wanted to study not the the functioning of the center. And of course, we know, because we conduct fieldwork, sometimes it's easier to work with migrants than to work with the bureaucrats. In this project, I interviewed the agents, the federal agents. I wanted to understand why are they working there, and how do their own subjectivities, their own life stories, their own way to discriminate, their own experience affects the implementation of policies. And what I found is that these bureaucrats, street level bureaucrats, I interviewed different levels of bureaucrats, but I'm mostly focused on the lowest ones, the ones that the first contact between the first respondents, the first contact between the migrants and the federal agencies, are these street level bureaucrats that are very much mistreated. They have very low wages. They are very much mistreated by their superiors, and there's always someone to mistreat the migrants. No? So it's like a chain of violations of institutional violence, of human rights violations, that end up with the vulnerable of the vulnerable. That is the immigration, the migrants detained in immigration centers. So I was much more motivated in my work through this tradition of ethnographic work in institutions and in state offices that is very much carried out in India. So there is, I'm quoting Gupta. He has created this, he published this book on anthropology of the state, and he says the focus on everyday practices rather than on spectacular displays of state power or unusual and secular events help one understand how the normal state of affairs is maintained, in which intensive violence toward poor populations is taken for granted. So my idea was to stay there, to be in a constant way observing and being part of everyday practices within this detention center in the south of Mexico. And I connected what I was seeing in the detention center with this public discourse of stigma on migrants. Migrants related to unhealthy conditions, this idea that migrants are dangerous, that maybe they are criminals, and now with the COVID pandemic, they are not only criminals, but they are sick people, no? And this is something, this was very much related to literature in Europe, to projects and research that is done in Greece, is done in Spain, and even in France, in Calais, on how these concentration camps or these refugee camps work through this global discourse on stigma. Of course, these are racialized immigrants, and they are seen as they are dangerous people, as if they are sick, and actually they don't arrive sick. They get sick while they go into these detention centers because of the conditions, no? So these are some pictures that I took. It's something that I must say, in Mexico, it's very difficult to get access to these places. I was able to get access through an NGO. I work very much in alliances with NGOs, and the few NGOs have access to these places to provide psycho and legal services to these populations. Of course, as a scholar, I was not allowed to take my mobile, whatever, but this day, I just dared to do that, and I took these two pictures. One is a canceled toilet, and the answer of the bureaucrat when I said the officer, why these were women toilets, why are these canceled? They said because the foreigners, they don't know how to use a toilet. So these toilets were canceled, and women had to go through an open toilet in the men's area. This is biopolitics. So this is not just a coincidence by chance in that place. No, this was repeated through many of the observations that I did. On my first day, the first thing that I observed was a bucket. In this is called 21st century office. So 21st century, you can imagine that technology. Don't think about just any office. It's a federal immigration detention center with wood facilities, with technology, but there was a bucket. And in the bucket was full of urine. So men, they have to go and pee in the bucket instead of a bathroom. So my first question was, why is there a bucket if this is called a 21st century immigration center? It's not because there are no toilets. I mean, there is a whole biopolitical way of organizing the place. So it was not only the bucket. It was a bucket, it was a canceled toilets. This is a shower, yeah. without water. And when you start interviewing migrants, they are always saying that bad quality of food, no medicines, one diaper per baby per day, one sanitary towel for each woman per day. So that unhealthy conditions, for me, it was something more. So I started to study through, and I know that I have few minutes. I started to study through the sociology of emotions. What is disgust? Is disgust a mechanism of power in detention center? What is the functionality of disgust? And I started to study. I went through a seminar of sociology of emotions, and actually there is a lot written about disgust. Disgust as a form of a mechanism of punishment, but also disgust as a way to create this social gap and this way of dehumanizing the other. Of course, from the sociology of emotions, we understand that disgust is a cultural construct, and it changes among cultures, and also that it is a social and moral emotion that condemns an object or a person for being considered pollutant, mainly related to body fluids and secretions. So also it is a primary emotion. It is considered an emotion to survive. Supposedly something that we feel disgust about something is because it will make us bad. No, when you feel that you see something that it makes you feel disgust, it's believed because it's a survival reaction. So I went through Martha Nussbaum, this American philosopher. She wrote about disgust, and she wrote about, this is a very good book that is called Humanity. I'm sorry, I forgot the name. I'll remember right now. But Nussbaum writes about disgust, and she says most society teach the avoidance of certain groups of people as physically disgusting, bearers of a contamination that a healthy element of society must keep at bay. So there is a social and cultural construct of disgust for the ill, for the others. And from that, and I'm going to finish now, I'm just 2 more slides. What's the function of disgust in immigration detention center from a biopolitical point of view? I find that there is a functionality of disgust that from the institutional perspective, disgust provides or helps to enhance the social distancing between the inmates and the guardians. It is understood detention centers as what American sociologist Goffman explains as total institutions. These places that are divided into 2 populations, the bad and the good, from Foucault's point of view, the normal and the deviant, and the social distances is the way these institutions are organized. And disgust actually enhances the social distances. It also facilitates practices of indifference and dehumanization, a mechanism of punishment. There are many, I gather many testimonies, and also other reports from other NGOs have gathered testimonies. They even talk about these places as places of torture and how people are being punished also by the living conditions, by the lack of privacy. Of course, this reinforces stigma, discrimination, and racism. I was talking some days ago with some of you that now we have Ukrainians in Mexico. They are waiting in the Mexican border to cross to the US. This will change. This today is in April 25. The US government will allow direct flights to the US instead of going to Mexico and then getting to the US. But there was this discourse that they were saying Ukrainians are more civilized. They are quite easy to handle as a population. There's a difference. They were arriving and they were directly taken to special shelters and directly taken to the border. So of course, people don't get angry if they are being helped. But what's happening with the other populations, the ones that are detained, the ones that have been waiting for 12, 16 months in these conditions, people get angry. But there is a stigma of the other, the poor Central and Black Central Americans that are dangerous, unhealthy. So there is this racism that has to do also with the unhealthy conditions. I don't know if I'm making my point. And it's interesting to contrast with the discourse on Ukrainians. And from the perspective of migrants, disgust makes them feel very uncomfortable. At the same moment that they were asking us, we were going through their procedures, through their from asylum procedures, and they said, okay, what did we ask them? What do you need for our next visit? You need to talk to a lawyer, you need to get your forms signed, whatever. And they said, yes, but I also need a deodorant. I also need, please, a toothpaste. I also need, you know, that the most basic hygienic conditions, they have lost them. And it's not only that makes them feel uncomfortable, but it makes them more vulnerable in terms of the rights. I have one testimony of one guy that he said, I couldn't have a razor for 3 months and I didn't recognize myself, because immigration detention is meant to be for 15 days, but we have documented cases of people that have been in these places for more than 10 months. So there is a clear impact in the being, in the subjectivity from the perspective of disgust. Of course, the increase of illness, the effects on mental health, and most importantly, it makes them feel punished. Just to end, this is my last slide. My conclusion is that disgust prevents feelings of concern, care, and compassion, of course, and it dehumanizes the other, dehumanizes the migrants, dehumanizes also the subject. So now immigrants in Mexico and forced migrants, instead of being subjects of rights, as they are supposed to be by the Mexican Constitution and the Mexican law, they are becoming subjects and beneficiaries of a humanitarian temporal aid. And when they are in detention, they are considered less than subjects of rights. They are considered population that must be deported, population that don't have access to basic rights as information, to know that Mexico is a country where they have a right to ask for asylum. They lost everything during their detention, and disgust accentuates human rights violations. And it instrumentalizes racism, disgust, the abandonment and neglect towards migrants, and it is a powerful mechanism to despise and humiliate others. And I think I'll finish here. I'm sure we have time to have questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alethia, for a great presentation. I think there were so many motives that that I think are for larger discussion, because they they relate to so many things that we also research on and we observe here. I think this Cartagena Declaration on Refugees that you mentioned, like this kind of alternative to the Geneva system, is a really topic that needs to be discussed more, because we all know that the Geneva system needs to be reformed to be able to come up to challenges of current eras. I really liked your ethnographic research, because I think that was really wonderful that you managed to go inside those places that's not that easy to get, and document what's going on. So I think that is wonderful work you did to document and to present the other perspective that is not so available to many of us. I think we will have many questions from the people. So first, I would like to give floor to people, but from our room, it's better to come here, to take the question. Konrad, you want to come back? Come here, that people can see you. You have a bottle of wine, please?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for super interesting presentation. I was wondering if you could go a little bit further with explaining how actually these detention centers work. In the case of Poland, the vast majority of centers are not detention centers. We have most similarly to Mexico, our centers, well, similarly and also differently than Mexico, our centers are located just by the eastern border. But they are the similarities that people await in these centers their decisions to be processed, their asylum applications. The similarities that they cannot move, they shouldn't move, but a lot of people, especially in the past, treated Poland as a transit country and illegally were leaving the country during the procedure. And then what was happening, that if they were caught in many other Western European countries, they were deported back to Poland. So this is the similarity. But I would be interested to know more how actually it works in the Mexican case, the detention center. You said that people stayed there between 15 and even a year. In the case, there is less, up until now, there's less sort of criminalization, I would say. Securitization is very much there. Racialization is very much there. But criminalization less so, I guess, in the case of Polish. If we compare Polish case to Ukrainian one, the interest. So it will be interesting to learn more about how it works with technically how many people are being deported, in what sort of conditions it happens, and what are the, it's not, for me, it wasn't surprising when you were saying about the rates of recognition, but it would be also important to know what are the protection measures available apart from the refugee status, because in the case of Europe in general, the region, Poland, refugee status is a very rare status which is being awarded, given, and also a very small percentage. Like if I was just analyzing data for our book yesterday and looked more broadly, not even Poland, but also other Central Eastern European countries, and the rate of recognition is sometimes 1% for many years. Sometimes it's higher, but if you consider other forms of protection being awarded, then the rates go much higher. So I wonder, what are the other forms of protection which are being awarded to these people? What it means, it will be also interesting. You were telling us a little bit about the economic elements of protection that people were given. Apart from shelter, what are they being given? I can tell you in the case of Poland, it is, for example, the allowances are also super difficult to survive. If you live outside of the centers, you are allowed in Poland, for example, and there is the vast majority of people in the last years live outside of the centers for foreigners, and they are being given, a single person can get over 100 euros per month to rent a property outside. You need to get a permission for this, but you are being given. So it will be interesting to know more about what are different support, financial and other support systems offered in the case of Mexico. And yeah, I've got plenty other questions, but I want others to have a chance to ask. One thing interesting, what you were telling us about the pandemic and the figures you were showing us. In the case of Poland, the accessions was hugely stopped during the pandemic. So it's interesting, and it very much rang a lot of bells when you were saying about the racialization. So because what you have in the Polish case is this schizophrenic situation when you have open arms attitude towards Ukrainian refugees, and at the same time you have pushbacks at the Polish-Belarusian border, and the families with children who are so warmly received if they come from Ukraine are being pushed back and not being allowed to apply for asylum if they come from Belarus, as if all the people who come from this particular destination are stigmatized and labeled as bogus refugees, supposedly, as those who are just economic migrants and who are element of the hybrid war. I'm just telling you what is the discourse and how it is being legitimized, the pushbacks. So the element of racialization is an unequal treatment is very much part of the Polish realities. Many more comparisons, and many questions, but I don't want to monopolize the discussion. So leave you to answer some of these questions, and you can also try to answer questions from the chat.
Okay. Haitians or Brazilians to be treated worse than what the... Okay. So what do? I start with this first round and then we follow? Okay. I will start with the one that is in the chat. That it says Haitians or Brazilians are treated worse than Guatemalans or Salvadorans. This is a case of Mexico.
It's simply about whiteness and not whiteness. So it's connected to what Conrad said about the problem of racism. So obviously, Haitians are less, on average, less, let's say, white. We can use the term.
Okay.
And then obviously, Salvadorans, for instance. If from my perspective and my experience in Brazil, unfortunately, Brazil, which is one of the most racist countries, unfortunately, in the world, this is obvious. Yes, if so, there is even profiling among police members according to blackness of the person. Yeah, who is more guilty, so a candidate for being a criminal, just to check it with the documents. Is this the case in Mexico as well, or it's or not,
okay.
or hopefully not?
Actually, it's a great question. There are two nationalities that you can have very important contrast in terms of skin color. Hondurans, because in Honduras, the Garifunas, this is something that is not very well known, but Garifunas is an ethnic group in Honduras and they are black. And in Cuba, you have blonde and blue-eyed people, and also you have black people. So from Cuba and Honduras, I would say you have this contrast, and you can clearly see the difference of treatment when they are in detention centers. In the case of Hondurans, the Garifunas, I think they are the worst treated, because with Cubans and with Haitians, they have a different education level usually, other cultural capital, better education, and another culture. Cubans are very much, they talk to the authorities. They don't subject to the authorities. Honduras, they do. So what we saw with the Haitians, there is a lot of discrimination and racism from the part of the Mexican society, but also, for example, now they are very well integrated in Tijuana. This is in the northern part of Mexico, because they said, well, after 3 or 4 years of having Haitians here, they are well integrated into the economy. Maybe they speak already Portuguese, or they speak English, or they speak French. So they have another cultural capital, and they have their own ways to create their economies. I was 2 months ago, less, 1 month and a half ago, I was in Chiapas, and it was interesting to see that the Haitians, for the first time, are starting to create their own economies. In the market, the typical market of the city, there is one street that is full of Haitians selling their own foods. So they get a way to integrate, even though there is a lot of racism. From the part of the immigration force, there is a clear discrimination, but I would say more with the people that don't speak Spanish. People from India, from Pakistan. I mean, it's horrible the way they are treated. There is no translation services. So there are a lot of testimonies that they are insulted, that they never tell them their rights. Nobody cares about having a translation service for them. So, but yeah, clearly there is racism. And I would say that the case of Cuba and the case of Honduras is much clearer. We don't have honestly the Brazilians coming to Mexico, But you saw, I should have explained that in my slide that I said that Brazilians was one of the main nationalities detained last year, but that's because they are children of Haitians born in Brazil. So it's a nationality, but they are from Haiti. Imagine the challenge that you have now, because these children, they are not irregular in Mexico. Brazilians don't need a visa to go to Mexico. So you have mixed families. Maybe the father has a refugee status in Chile. The mother was never to be regulated. Children are born in Brazil, and they want to get asylum in the US. So that's why I'm thinking, well, not me, that's why we're discussing, we need to understand protection and migration policies in terms of the regional real access to international protection. But yes, there is clear racism with Black people in detention centers and in general in migration and in terms of migration policy. Trying to answer about both interventions. Well, first, yes, I think ethnographic work, it helps us to see different perspectives. At the end, the book is published in Spanish. My book is called Immigration Detention, Practices of Disgust, Contempt, and Humiliation. I just forgot the name of the book. But the idea is to show also the side of the internal side of the Institute of National Migration of these bureaucrats. In my experience, I got much information with former agents, the people who already left the system, were not able to comply with the system, and they left. And it is interesting to see the power positions and the power relationships that are happening within the organization, and how are they always replying towards other immigration agents. For example, in the south of Mexico, they are more indigenous than in the north. So also between them, there is discrimination, gender discrimination with female immigration agents. So it's interesting to analyze, and this is something that could only be done through ethnographic work, to analyze the power relationships within the immigration detention center. And what was Conrad asking? It's important to see that there is, I talk about the exceptionality of the law and the discretionary use of immigration policy, because in immigration law in Mexico, there is the article 111, and this article actually talks about that the period for detention should be 15 days, working days. And in some cases, very particular one can go up until 60 working days, but pay attention, 60 working days is a lot. And as well as 15 working days is 3 weeks. But when people present, in Mexico, we call it an amparo. So this is an administrative resource to stop deportation. They have to accept indefinite detention. And this is part of the law. And in terms of the UN Committee of Immigration Workers and their families, this is called arbitrary detention. So first, I need to explain, getting irregularly to Mexico is not a crime. It is an administrative fault. So Mexican legislation is very tricky because they don't call it detention, they call it presentation, and they don't call it, they said this is an administrative fault. So in this way, they don't have the UN Commission actually monitoring what's happening. But this is not actually like this, because when the whole treatment is as if they committed a crime, not as an administrative fault. So when people are in detention and they talk to a lawyer or an NGO and they want to say, no, I don't want to be deported, I want to present an administrative resource, then they have to accept indefinite detention. And then it's when we have the cases of having people for 3, 4, 6 months. And the problem, because I also conducted at the same time, when I was going through this place, I conducted fieldwork in a prison, in a jail in Mexico City, a real jail. And I saw the contrast. And the problem is that these detention centers are not created for long-term detentions. So they don't have the facilities, they don't have proper facilities, installations. And so there is a big problem of having this type of exceptionality in the law, so they can allow indefinite detention. You talk about what do we have apart from refugee status? There are other mechanisms, but what we saw, maybe similar to what's happening in Poland, these mechanisms are only put into action if there is political will. No, it's like if international law is submitted to political will. There are different mechanisms. First, the humanitarian visitor's card. It lasts for 1 year. There are other complementary protection mechanisms, but this is the most common. And it is only activated when the Mexican government decides strategically, for example, with the Mexican caravans, from the caravans in 2018 and 19. This is activated when for example, there was a crisis now. 1 month ago, the Mexican president went to Chiapas, to the south part of the country, and there were revolts. People have been waiting there for 18 months. And for the president was so easy to say, for everyone that is here, humanitarian cards. They gave humanitarian cards to the families that were there, but there was, of course, many other families wanted to have the same humanitarian card. And it's tricky because it only lasts 1 year. And it's tricky because it actually doesn't allow them to have like more social, I will explain this, like social protection schemes. But well, this is easier because it lasts only 4 days to get your card. The other, and it used to be very common with extra-continental nationalities, people coming from Africa, from India, Pakistan, China. Mexico doesn't have deportation agreements. Imagine how expensive it would be to deport these people. So they used to have a permit to freely move in the Mexican territory between 30 and 60 days. So this was a way to keep them going to the US. But now, if the US closed the borders, as it has done it in the last 3 years for asylum seekers, it's less common to have this permit, but it's still one that is used for other nationalities. And the reality is that many people abandon their asylum cases. The asylum has become only the way to start a way of stopping deportation, because you say, well, I am looking for asylum. But again, depends on the political will. We have seen many cases of deportations of people with already asylum procedure or refugees. Refugees have also been deported. Or there is also another thing that is common, that you got an immigration alert. How does it work? Nobody knows. The government in Guatemala or the government in Honduras starts this alert. So the Mexican authorities receive the alert and they decide that with this alert, you become dangerous or a threat to the Mexican state. So even though you are a refugee, you are recognized as a refugee because you were being persecuted in your own country. The Mexican state suddenly recognizes that alert posed that by that country that has been persecuting you, and for that reason you can be deported. So again, there's everything has to do with the political will and the political compromise with the US of criminalizing and stopping migration.
So people who have already
People have been deported. It's not that common, but we have cases. I have documented one particular case of a guy from El Salvador. He had been a refugee for 3 years. And one day he approached the authorities because he was helping his nephew to start a procedure. And they took him and they said, you have an alert. You go to immigration detention. He was there for 4 months and he was going to be deported. He had legal protection from an NGO and we stopped his deportation case. But it has also been common that refugees, even with international protection, are deported. Regarding the economic elements for protection, we are seeing this around the destination and transit areas, border areas. What is called humanitarian border, for me, is a very interesting concept. Is also more created here in the European Union case, is the interaction and the coexistence of international organizations, the UNHCR, the IOM, together with control policies of local governments. So the main actors now providing economic protection are UNHCR through the program similar to the ones that is used now for Ukrainians here in Poland to receive a monthly allowance for 3 months. And also the local NGOs have been key actors, particularly in the pandemic, because there was no federal programs, not even for Mexicans. I showed you at the beginning of the presentation that I am part of a project called Caminar, and we created this comparative research in 7 countries in Latin America, and Mexico was the only country in the whole region with no particular protection programs in the context of the pandemic for migrants. Brazil had programs, Uruguay, of course, even Peru, Ecuador, the same programs that they had for their nationals, they opened them for migrants. It was not the case of Mexico. Mexico City is a particular case. This is a sanctuary city, and they do have some particular social protection programs, but the main non-cash transfers and cash transfers are coming from international organizations, and the law only give access to basic human health, basic health services and education, but they don't allow access to work. Only if you already started your procedure or if you are a refugee. And we also talk about the schizophrenic policies. The other day you talk about the schizophrenic. Actually, we do have one publication and we talk about schizophrenic migration policy. And I think that's it for the moment.
Since when applying for international protection is possible in Mexico, and why for several years they were, as far as I could see, a very low number of people where the channels was becoming open, and that was and why they raised so much. What are the biggest groups? What's the number of irregular migrants there? Are there any estimations? Any kind of estimations? What works better in terms of international protection of migrants in Mexico? If there is anything that works better than in the case of what you know about sexual registration, that would be interesting.
Sorry, can you repeat the last one?
The last one is, what do you think works better in Mexico when it comes to asylum seekers in elements of the reception or integration policies?
Okay.
Then what we have here in Central Eastern.
Okay. So how many irregular? Okay, Mexico has a tradition of asylum, but in very particular moments of history. The Spanish Civil War. So Mexico received many Spanish people fleeing from war. This was in the late 40s, 30s and 40s. Many people from Spain, and then we had important number of refugees in the 70s and 80s from the dictatorships in South America, Chile and Argentina and Uruguay. Important tradition receiving them. But you can see the profile is very different. People from Spain, from Argentina, from Chile, Uruguay, we're talking about black people, white people, white Catholic people, or not Catholic, in the case of Spain, we're not Catholic, but with a lot of high-skilled immigrants. They were very important in terms of the intellectual prosperity of the country, etc. Then in the 80s, with the wars in Guatemala, the civil wars in Guatemala and El Salvador, there was also an important tradition of refugees fleeing from war. But for many years, but we didn't need, because Mexico was not a country of destination. So even though we had these particular historical moments, the COMAR, that is the office to provide asylum in Mexico, it just opened in the 80s. Imagine, only 40 years ago, we started to have this office, and with very small budget. And today, still, the budget between the difference between COMAR, that is the office in charge of asylum, and the gap with, or the contrast with INM, the office for securitization, is huge. So you have only 19 people with the power to sign in, for refugee procedures, 19 in the whole country. And in the other side, you have the INM with huge budget, with a lot of personnel. So this is something that is also political. The COMAR, the one for international protection, is part of the internal ministry, and the other is part of the INM is part of the foreign ministries of affairs. So this is a political decision. The problem is that now with the caravans, we started to have more asylum requests, but with no institutional capacity. No, so I think it's something. It's not because there is no budget; it's because there is no political will to open these channels for international protection. Then the other question: how many people? Usually, since the last 20 years, more or less, we have 500,000 transit flows coming each year. 500,000 each year. It has gone up and go down. Last year was a year with the highest number of asylum requests, 120,000, and also the highest in detention, 310,000 more or less. So we would say that talking about irregular migration, it's in transit. So maybe it's less than 1 million. There's no exact numbers. We do have a lot of service. Mexico is well known for having good service. And we know how many people enter the territory from the southern border, but from that number, some of them go to the US, some of them are deported. So I would say that more or less is 600, 700,000 irregular migrants currently in Mexico. But it's always depending, because these are population that are trying to get to the US, they are deported, but so that's why we don't have exact measure of that. And the last question, what is better? There is a good program, I don't know if you have it here, and this program is not a governmental program, it's by the UNHCR to relocate populations of refugees. So it is in Mexico, it's so important now because, as I said, 85% of asylum requests starts in Chiapas, and they have to stay in Chiapas. So with this program, they are relocating them to the north states where there is a lot of maquila. There is need of this workforce because it's a border with the US. So actually they relocate these communities in safer places where they have better access to have jobs and to integrate in the communities. But unfortunately, I couldn't say that we have better practices or good practices in the region. I would say this is the only program that is sort of working, and we are kind of learning. I'm not justifying, but this is a region that has very recently started to receive forced migrants. But we are in this moment with different local actors trying. Everyone wants to get their share in terms of gaining access to this place.
Relatively low level of positive decisions, but still there are people who are better. I mean, if the labor market accepting these people, I mean, what do you have any knowledge what happens once they get the asylum? Are they staying and working, or they have some other plans, or they just need also social security? Is there any social security doesn't exist? Yeah. So
like the social protection mechanisms are very limited for immigrants and refugees. We conducted a research particularly on social protection during the pandemic for refugees and migrants, and the problem is that there is a lot of, again, racism and difference between nationalities. In the case of Venezuelans, they are better integrated, and again, they have higher educational levels, and they are very much well received. In the case of Central Americans, they have very low skilled, they are low skilled migrants. They have low levels of education. They are poor, they are Black. So they are very much rejected. And the type of jobs they can get are the type of jobs that most of Mexicans can get. Mexico is a country that has very high levels of inequality. I don't say Mexico is a poor country. Mexico is an unequal country. The richest, now I think it's no longer like that, but one of the richest men in the world is Mexican, Carlos Slim. So in the 5 top in the world of the richest men in Mexico, in the world, 1 is Mexican. So Mexico is not poor, Mexico is unequal. So the problem and the lot of xenophobic practices is because they say, why are we going to give jobs to the Central Americans if these jobs are the ones that must be taken by Mexicans? So the same discourse as we've seen in other places. The problems with Central Americans is that they don't get easily integrated. Why? Because, or they, for example, they are very much exploited. Women as sex workers or as housekeepers, but really they earn nothing. I mean, because Mexican people know they want the job, so the wages are very, very low, sorry. So yeah, I think we're having the same problems than in other places, but the difference between destination or traditional destination countries is that there is a market, or there is an offer of this type of workforce, and in Mexico still there is not. The case is different for people from Cuba and from people from Venezuela, but Cubans don't want to stay in Mexico. Cubans actually have a lot of resources. The problem with Cubans is that they need to cross Mexico, but Cubans have family in Miami. Cubans will not stay in Mexico. Venezuelans, they do stay, but then they stay in the education, or in, I don't know, they are teachers, they are doctors, they are professionists. So it's different case by case, I would say.
So to mean that some people get the asylum, they still go further. They not all of them they want to stay in Mexico.
Maybe the transit country.
Yeah, I would say many Central Americans decide to stay in Mexico, but it was not the original destination. It is a forced destination, I would say. And if there is an opportunity to go to the north, they will. This program with the UNHCR, that they locate people in the northern border, actually is quite successful. Like 60–65% of people stay, but there is between a 30–35% that want to go to the US, and they, after 6 months or 8 months of living in these cities in the north, they try to go, and sometimes they cross irregularly in the US. They don't cross as asylum seekers. They decide if there's a chance to cross, they will always try to cross. Not through humanitarian parole, no, they would like to cross irregularly to the US. Okay. No. Okay, so we would like
yes, because we will continue the discussion certainly afterwards. Yes, but let's just sum up the formal part. So we would like to thank so much, Alethia, to you for this wonderful presentation and for your great research. I think this topic is extremely important. Also from our perspective, from European perspective, there is a lot that we can compare and see, and like many points that are interesting for us. So thanks a lot for coming and for presenting. And just to end, I would like to say that next month we are planning next seminars. We will see if it will be possible in the hybrid mode as well, and then we would invite everyone to our university. One of the topic that will be for the future is about Senegalese migration. It's international migration. That's still from our film project, the last case of 4 case studies. So I hope before the holidays we will have another seminar on that, and all the other news we will announce on Facebook. So thank you very much for listening, for taking part in the seminar. Yes, and we hope to meet next time. Thank you very much.